Good evening, dear listener. I'm glad you're here. Make yourself comfortable. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw unclench. And give yourself permission to do nothing for a little while. Tonight's story is gentle and unhurried, the kind you can simply float on. If your mind has been busy, you don't have to push the thoughts away. You can let them drift past like small leaves on quiet water. Take a slow breath in and a slower breath out. There's nowhere you need to be except here, in a warm, safe evening, with a little autumn mist and the calm sound of water close by. He had stepped out without any particular plan, which was exactly the point. The day had been full in the normal way, small responsibilities, soft interruptions, messages that seemed urgent until they weren't. And now, at last, the evening had arrived like a blanket laid carefully over the city. Not heavy, not smothering, just tender. The air carried that unmistakable autumn gentleness, cool enough to wake the skin, warm enough not to sting. A light drizzle hung in it, more a presence than an event, so fine it didn't quite count as rain. Yet it left everything with a quiet shine. He closed the door behind him and stood for a moment on the building's stone step, letting the outside settle around him. The street smelled faintly of wet leaves and old brick. Somewhere nearby, a bicycle chain clicked, then faded. He drew his coat a little closer, not from cold, but from comfort, and began to walk toward the canal. This part of the city was old in a way that felt cared for, as if time had been invited to stay and had agreed to behave. The houses leaned slightly toward one another, shoulder to shoulder along narrow lanes, their windows glowing with honey-colored light. The shutters were painted in deep, calm colors, forest green, midnight blue, the kind of red that looked warm rather than loud. Street lamps cast soft circles on the cobblestones, and those cobblestones, damp from the mist, reflected the lamps like small scattered coins. His footsteps were quiet here. The drizzle and the wet stones softened sound, and his shoes made only a gentle, cushioned tap. It pleased him, that softness. It made the city feel receptive, as if it were listening too. He passed a small square where trees stood in orderly lines, their leaves thinning, yellow and copper and brown. The branches held a few stubborn leaves that moved with every faint breeze, and the drizzle clung to them, gathering into drops that fell now and then, slow and patient. Across the square, a cafe was closing, chairs turned upside down on tables. chalkboard sign being wiped clean. Inside, a warm light made the windows look like lanterns. He caught a glimpse of a barista in an apron, hair pinned up, laughing softly at something someone said. The sound didn't carry far. It didn't need to. It was enough to know it existed. He continued, drawn the way one is drawn by something steady and familiar. The canal was not far, and the closer he came, the more he could sense it not as a sight yet, but as an atmosphere. The streets sloped almost imperceptibly. The air grew a shade cooler, and the city's scents shifted from brick and leaves to water and stone. Then he turned a corner, and the canal was there, running through the old city like a long, dark ribbon. It wasn't wide. It didn't rush. It moved with a confident slowness, carrying the reflections of lamps and windows on its surface, as if carrying them were its ordinary work. The drizzle dimpled the water in countless tiny circles. Each droplet arrived with a soft, precise touch, making the reflections quiver and then settle again. The lights stretched in the water gold and amber, and pale white wavering like ribbons of silk. He stood still on the path for a moment, letting his gaze soften, letting the scene wash through him. He began to walk along the canal's edge, where an old stone embankment rose from the water. The stone was darkened by moisture and age, its surface slick in places, rough in others. When he brushed his fingers against it, just briefly, as if greeting it, he felt the coolness of wet stone, a steady, honest coolness, and a faint grit that reminded him this wall had been here a long time, watching many evenings like this one pass by. His steps stayed soft. The path was laid with small stones, and the damp made them forgiving. Each footfall sounded like a quiet agreement with the night. I'm here. I'm not in a hurry. I'm safe. Boats were moored along the canal, small ones, practical ones, a few with curved wooden edges and neat ropes. They sat low in the water, patient and still. Their covers were beaded with moisture, and the ropes looked darker where they were wet. One boat had a small lantern fixed at its stern, not lit, just waiting, its glass speckled with drizzle. Across the water, buildings leaned over the canal, their lower walls meeting the embankment, their windows close enough to the surface that the reflections seemed to be part of the architecture. Curtains moved slightly behind glass. A silhouette crossed a window and disappeared again, the normal privacy of evening. cat sat on a sill in another window, a solid little shadow, watching the water as if it understood something about it. He walked past a baker's shop, closed for the night, and yet the air carried a hint of it anyway, the faint, distant perfume of warm bread and sugar that had settled into the street itself. It came to him in soft pulses as the breeze shifted, a whisper of butter, the memory of cinnamon, a clean warmth like toasted flour. It made his chest loosen in a way he hadn't realized it was tight. The scent didn't demand anything. It simply offered itself and moved on. He thought, not in words exactly, but in a gentle feeling. There is so much kindness in ordinary things. As he continued, the city seemed to slow around him. Not literally, somewhere, surely. Someone hurried home. Someone checked a clock. Someone finished an email. But in his immediate circle, everything was moving at the pace of water. The lamps were steady. The drizzle was steady. His breathing found a steady rhythm too. There was a bridge ahead, one of the little arched bridges that stitched the two sides of the canal together. It was made of stone and had low walls, worn smooth at the top by centuries of hands and rain and passing time. He could see the bridge's reflection in the water, a pale arc that trembled gently with each new drop of mist. He approached it and felt a quiet anticipation, not excitement, just a sense of arriving at a small, familiar landmark. Bridges always felt like invitations. Even a small bridge like this one offered a pause, a slightly higher view, a moment to stand in the center and look both ways. He stepped onto the bridge. The stones under his feet were damp and darker than the surrounding path, and his steps became even softer, almost a whisper. The wet stone held the day's cooling, and it rose faintly into the soles of his shoes. The bridge's low wall was slick to the touch in places, and he placed his palm carefully on it, feeling the smoothness, the rounded edge worn by time. He reached the center and stopped. From here, the canal opened out in both directions. On one side, it curved gently away, lined with lamps and windows that made a trail of light into the distance. On the other, it ran straighter, disappearing under another bridge farther away, where the lights gathered and blurred, like a constellation bending toward the water. He leaned slightly against the low wall, not putting his weight fully, just resting, and listened. The canal had its own language. The water made a subtle, constant sound as it moved against the stone, a soft hush, a breath. There was a little lap-lap against a moored boat, and the faint creak of rope adjusting. The drizzle added its tiny punctuation, 1,000 quiet taps. Somewhere under the bridge, water met a hidden edge and made a slightly deeper note, a gentle plunk that repeated patiently. He let the sounds arrange themselves. They required nothing from him. They were steady, safe, and old sounds that had existed long before he arrived, and would exist long after he left. And yet they included him now, as if the evening had been waiting for him to listen. A couple walked on the far side of the canal, their shared umbrella tilted slightly toward the wind. They moved slowly, close to each other. Their voices were low and indistinct, more like music than speech. The umbrella was a dark shape that made the warm streetlight behind it seem even softer. He watched them for a moment with a calm sense of tenderness, and then let his gaze return to the water. The reflections were different from up here. From the path, they had been ribbons. From the bridge, they looked like long brush strokes laid across the surface. The lights stretched and trembled, the warm glow becoming a living thing in the canal, responding to each small movement. A drop of drizzle would land, and the reflection would ripple outward, changing shape, then settling back into a new calm arrangement. He thought about how the city offered light to the water, and the water offered it back, imperfectly, beautifully. Nothing was wasted. Even the drizzle, even the wet stone, even the coldness in the air had their part. He took a slow breath and let it out. In his chest, a simple gratitude unfolded, quiet and wide. Gratitude for the city being here. Gratitude for his own feet that carried him. Gratitude for the safety of this moment, for the fact that he could stand on an old stone bridge and listen to water without fear. He didn't force the feeling. He didn't analyze it. He just let it be, like the light on the canal. A faint breeze arrived and moved across the bridge. It brought with it another wave of that distant bakery, scent soft, warm, and comforting, as if someone somewhere had opened a door to let heat escape into the night. The smell mixed with the dampness in the air, creating a strange, lovely combination. Wet stone and warm bread, rain and cinnamon, old canal and fresh pastry. It made the city feel even more alive, even more gentle. He could imagine a baker far away, wiping flour from their hands, turning off the last oven light, leaving tomorrow's dough to rest. There was something reassuring about the thought, about the idea of bread rising quietly while the city slept. Behind him, a bicycle bell chimed once, polite and soft. He shifted slightly to make space, and a cyclist rolled over the bridge at an easy pace, the wheels making a muted sound on the damp stones. The rider passed without hurry, coat collar up, head slightly bowed against the drizzle. The bell sound faded, and the canal's voice returned to the foreground. He stayed on the bridge a little longer, feeling the way the stone held him steady. Then, when it felt natural, he pushed away gently from the low wall and continued on, crossing to the other side. The path here was narrower, closer to the canal. A low iron railing ran along parts of it, and the iron was cool and wet, shining under the lamps. The drizzle had gathered into tiny beads on each bar. He ran his fingers lightly along the top rail for a moment, feeling the smoothness interrupted by the regular rhythm of posts, like a quiet metronome for his walk. His footsteps remained soft, and he became aware again of how pleasant it was to walk in a city that absorbed sound rather than throwing it back. The wetness made every surface gentler. Even the air seemed padded. He passed a doorway with a carved stone frame, the kind of doorway that hinted at history. A merchant's house once, perhaps, or a building that had been something else before it became what it was now. A small lamp hung above the door, and its light made the raindrops in the air visible for a second as they fell. Tiny threads, silver and brief. Farther along, the canal widened slightly, enough to create a broader mirror for the lights. On the water's surface, the reflections moved as if they were breathing. The windows across the canal were framed in dark wood, and their panes glowed. Some had plants on the sill, their leaves glossy with indoor warmth. Some had books stacked near the glass, spines catching the light. One had a small paper star hanging from the top of the frame, turning slightly in an unseen draft. He felt no loneliness watching these quiet signs of life. It was the opposite. It was a comforting awareness that the city held many small, private worlds, each one warm, each one self-contained, and that he was allowed to be here outside among them, held by the larger world of streets and water and light. The drizzle continued, so light it hardly touched his face, only cooled it occasionally. like the faintest kiss of air. His hair might be getting damp, but it didn't matter. The mist made everything more intimate. It blurred the edges of the city just enough to make it feel like a painting, like a place in a story. And yet the stone under his feet was real. The water was real. And his breath was real. He slowed again when he saw another small bridge ahead. This one with a slightly higher arch. A pair of lamps stood on either side of it, their light reflecting on the wet stone like melted gold. Between the lamps, the bridge rose, and beyond it, the canal continued into a darker stretch where fewer windows faced the water. As he approached, he noticed a small detail that made him smile. On the bridge's low wall, someone had placed a little pot of flowers, autumn flowers, pale and hardy, their petals damp but still open. The pot was simple terracotta, darkened by the drizzle. The flowers looked like they belonged there, as if the bridge itself had decided to decorate. He stepped up onto this bridge, and again the stones muted his footsteps. The bridge felt like a gentle incline, a slow lift of the body. At the top, he paused, not because he needed to, but because pausing here seemed like part of the bridge's purpose. Below him, the water passed under the arch with a slightly deeper sound, as if the canal cleared its throat before continuing. He leaned his elbows lightly on the low wall and watched the surface. A leaf drifted by, yellow and curled, turning slowly as it moved. It caught the light for a moment, glowed, then slipped back into shadow. He watched it disappear, feeling a small satisfaction in the simplicity of it. A leaf, a current, the evening doing what evenings do. He listened again, and this time he heard something else. The faint, distant sound of music. It was so far away it might have been imagined, a melody that could have been a radio in a kitchen, or someone playing softly in an upstairs room. It was muffled by the drizzle and the stone and the distance. It didn't intrude. It added a thin thread of sweetness to the air. He stayed there until the music faded or shifted into something he could no longer catch. Then he straightened and continued walking, coming down the other side of the bridge. The path led into a slightly quieter stretch of the canal, where the buildings were set back a little. Here there were small trees planted along the water, their trunks darkened by moisture, their branches bare enough to show the shape of them clearly. The lamps were fewer, and the reflections on the water became more spacious, darker between the bands of light. The city's smell changed again. The bakery scent was behind him now. Here, the air smelled more like water and leaves, and the faint mineral scent of stone. It was a clean, grounding smell, like the city's bones. He noticed the way his own thoughts had slowed. They no longer jumped. They arrived gently, if they arrived at all, and then they drifted away. He didn't have to solve anything. He didn't have to plan. He only had to walk, to feel the damp air, to listen to water. The simplicity felt like a gift. Another person passed him, walking in the opposite direction. An older man with a hat pulled low, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders relaxed. They nodded to each other, a small acknowledgement without words. The nod felt like part of the city's quiet safety, an unspoken rule. We see each other. We mean no harm. We share this evening. The drizzle became slightly more noticeable for a while, not heavier exactly, but more present. The tiny drops gathered on his coat, making it darken and shine in places. A few drops slid down the fabric in slow paths. The lamps reflected in those droplets too, miniature versions of the canal's light, traveling with him. He reached a place where the canal widened into a small basin, a quiet pocket of water where several boats were gathered. The boats were different shapes and sizes, and their reflections overlapped, creating a patchwork of dark forms and golden streaks. A small wooden dock extended into the basin, its planks wet and gleaming. He stepped onto the dock carefully. The wood gave slightly under his weight, a gentle response. It was stable, but alive. The dock's surface was cool and damp, and his steps made a softer, duller sound than on stone. He walked to the end and stopped, looking out over the basin. Here, the water's voice was different. It had more room. The lap against the boats was broader, less frequent, like slow breathing. The drizzle created a delicate texture on the surface, a constant stippling. The reflections of lamps stretched longer here, and the dark areas between them looked deep and calm. He watched the water and felt a quiet sense of being held. The city was behind him and around him, but on the dock he felt slightly apart, in a small sanctuary made of wood and water and mist. He could hear the city too, the faint hum of distant traffic, the far-off murmur of voices, but it was all softened, as if the drizzle had wrapped it in wool. He thought about gratitude again, and this time it came with more shape. Gratitude for being able to notice, gratitude for the fact that his body, his mind, his life had brought him to this moment, gratitude even for the drizzle, for the way it made the lights blur and glow, for the way it made the city seem kinder. He let his hands rest on the dock's railing, feeling the wet wood under his palms. It was smooth in places where many hands had touched it. The moisture made it slightly slick, but it didn't feel unsafe. The water below was calm. The boats barely moved. The whole scene felt like something arranged to ease a tired mind. After a while, he turned and walked back along the dock, returning to the stone path. The transition from wood to stone was subtle, but satisfying, like changing from one gentle rhythm to another. As he continued along the canal, the city began to offer small surprises again. A narrow side street opened up, revealing a tiny shop with its lights still on. In the window were delicate pastries arranged on trays, tarts glazed to shine, small cakes dusted with sugar. The shop door was closed, but the sight alone was enough to bring back the bakery scent in his imagination. Butter, vanilla, something toasted and warm. A little farther, he passed a doorway where a small lamp burned low. Under the lamp was a bench of dark wood. Someone had left a scarf on the bench, folded neatly, as if it had been placed there intentionally rather than forgotten. He paused and looked at it for a moment. It was a soft color, perhaps gray, perhaps blue, hard to tell in the warm light. It looked clean, safe. He didn't touch it. He simply noted it, like a small human detail in the city's larger pattern. The canal narrowed again and curved. He followed it without thinking, letting it guide him. Around the curve, the lamps were closer together, and the reflections on the water became more intense. The buildings leaned in more here. A few windows were open a crack, and warm air drifted out, carrying the faint scent of tea or soap, or something comforting and domestic. He walked past a small arched doorway that led down to the water, an old access point, perhaps for loading goods long ago. The steps were stone and wet, descending into shadow. He looked at them, imagining barrels and baskets, and people with rolled sleeves. But the imagination didn't pull him into the past too strongly. The present was enough. He came to another bridge, broader than the others, with a gentle curve and a view that made him slow before he even reached it. The bridge had an iron railing with decorative curls, and at its base were stone pillars topped with round The lamps were brighter here, casting a wider circle of light. The drizzle in that light looked like fine threads falling steadily from the sky. He climbed the bridge and stopped at the center again, because the center seemed to call for it. From here, he could see a long stretch of the canal in both directions, and the city's lights multiplied in the water. The reflections seemed endless. The drizzle blurred them slightly, making the lights look softer and more romantic, like candles seen through a veil. A tram bell sounded faintly in the distance, one clear note, then nothing. He imagined a tram moving through another part of the city, warm inside, windows fogged, people sitting quietly as they traveled home. The thought added to his sense of safety, of being part of a world that was functioning gently, carrying people where they needed to go. He leaned on the railing and listened to the plash of water against stone. It was a sound that never insisted. It was always there, ready to be noticed, ready to be ignored, steady either way. He let it fill the space behind his thoughts, like a soft, continuous lullaby. A small gust of wind moved through, and for a moment the drizzle slanted. The water's surface changed, the reflections stretching and shifting. Then the wind passed, and everything returned to its patient rhythm. He watched this and felt something settle deeper in him, an understanding that change could be gentle. That movement didn't always mean disruption. Sometimes it just meant a new arrangement of light. He realized his face was relaxed, his brow smooth. His hands were warm inside his coat pockets. The drizzle cooled his cheeks slightly, and it felt pleasant. He wasn't trying to get anywhere. He was simply walking, simply being. When he left the bridge, he noticed the canal path on the far side was lined with small trees in pots, perhaps placed there by a cafe or by the city itself. The pots were dark with moisture, and the leaves of the trees, still holding on, though sparse, shone where the lamp light touched them. As he passed, one of the trees released a single drop of water from a leaf tip. The drop fell, slow and clear, and landed on the stone with a tiny sound. It was such a small thing, but it felt like punctuation, like the evening quietly saying, "Yes, this too." He continued. The city here had a different texture. There were fewer shops, more residences. The curtains were thicker, the lights dimmer. The canal felt narrower, more intimate. The path was bordered by a low stone wall, and the stones were uneven, each one slightly different, their edges rounded by age. Water darkened the mortar lines, making a pattern that looked like a map. His footsteps remained soft, and he noticed how his body had adjusted to the pace. His shoulders moved freely. His breathing matched his steps. Each inhale drew in the damp, cool air. Each exhale released warmth into the night. His exhale was visible sometimes, a faint mist of his own, joining the drizzle. He passed a small door set into the canal wall, half hidden by ivy. The ivy was wet and glossy, its leaves deep green, and the door looked old, its wood dark and swollen from many seasons. It had an iron handle shaped like a simple ring. He didn't know where it led, perhaps to a storage space, perhaps to a cellar that opened near the water. He liked not knowing. The mystery felt gentle, not threatening. In this city, even unknown doors seemed to belong to safe, ordinary lives. A little farther on, he saw a small light low to the ground, a candle in a lantern placed on a windowsill near the canal. The candle's flame flickered softly, protected by glass. Its reflection in the water was a small, trembling line of gold. He watched it for a moment, feeling the tenderness of it. Someone had put that candle there intentionally. For beauty, perhaps. For comfort. For no reason at all, except that it pleased them. He felt the same impulse, to add a bit of softness to the world just because. He didn't have a candle with him, but he had attention. He gave the lantern his attention, and it felt like a kind of participation. The drizzle began to lighten, becoming even more delicate. The air stayed damp, but the drops were smaller, almost invisible except under the lamps. The city's sounds became slightly clearer as the mist thinned. The faint clink of dishes somewhere, the distant laugh of someone on a balcony, the gentle roll of a suitcase on cobblestones far away. He walked toward a place where the canal met a small intersection of waterways. Here, the water opened into a wider space, and a small fountain, very modest, sent up a low spray. The spray caught the lamp light and became a soft, luminous mist. The fountain's sound added another layer to the canal's voice, a slightly brighter, more playful splashing. Still quiet, still safe. He stood near the fountain and watched the spray fall back into the water. Drops rose, shone, and disappeared. The water accepted them without complaint. The reflections near the fountain were more broken, more alive, and he found it soothing to watch the constant, small change. Nearby, a bakery, this one open late, had its door cracked and warm air spilled out. The smell reached him clearly now. Fresh bread, buttery pastry, something sweet with almonds. It was not overpowering. It was simply warm. He could almost taste it in the back of his throat, that comforting flavor of baked dough and sugar. Inside, he could see a person behind the counter, wiping surfaces, moving slowly. A few pastries remained in the display, shining under the warm light. The scene looked like a painting. Golden interior, dark street, drizzle at the threshold like a curtain. He didn't go in. He didn't need to. The smell was enough. The knowledge that warmth existed, that people were baking and cleaning and closing up, was enough. It made him feel quietly cared for, even though no one was caring for him directly. The city itself felt like a caretaker, offering little comforts: light, scent, water, stone. He resumed his walk, moving away from the fountain and back along the canal's quieter edge. As time passed, the evening deepened. The sky was a dark, soft gray, the color of velvet. The lamps seemed brighter against it. The drizzle, now mostly a gentle mist, made halos around the lights. The halos were not sharp circles, but soft glows that blended into the air. The city looked like it was lit from within. He found himself smiling slightly, not at anything specific, just at the simple pleasure of being here. His mind was calm. His mood was steady and grateful. He felt no need to do more than this, to walk along water, to stop sometimes, to listen. He approached yet another small bridge, this one narrower, with a simple stone arch and no lamps of its own. It borrowed light from nearby windows and a street lamp set back from the canal. The bridge's stones were darker, and the wetness made them glisten faintly, like skin in candlelight. He stepped onto it and felt the slight rise. At the center, he stopped again, naturally, as if the bridges themselves had taught him a rhythm. Walk, pause, listen, continue. He placed his hands on the low wall and looked down at the water passing under. Here, the water sounded deeper. The arch concentrated the sound, and he could hear a more distinct plash as the canal met the bridge's underside. It wasn't loud. It was simply clear. The sound seemed to come from a hidden place, like a secret being spoken gently. He listened until he could distinguish different notes. The soft lap against stone, the tiny taps of remaining drizzle, the occasional hollow echo under the arch. The canal was like an instrument, and the city was playing it without trying. He thought of all the people who had stood on this bridge before him, perhaps centuries ago. Someone had leaned here with wet hands after hauling something from a boat. Perhaps someone had paused here to take a breath before returning home. Perhaps someone had met another person here and shared a quiet moment. The bridge had held them all. It held him now. The thought didn't make him feel small. It made him feel connected, like he was one thread in a long, gentle fabric. When he moved on, the path led him toward a slightly more open area where the canal ran alongside a small park. The park was simple. A few benches, a low hedge, trees with thinning leaves. The grass was darkened by moisture. Benches were wet, shining under a lamp, and empty. The emptiness felt peaceful rather than lonely. It meant there was space. It meant quiet. He walked along the park edge, listening to his own soft steps, the occasional rustle of leaves, the steady presence of water. The smell of wet earth mixed with the canal's scent. Somewhere in the park, a bird shifted in a tree, a tiny movement, then stillness again. He found a place where the path widened slightly, and a low stone platform extended over the water. It looked like a small lookout point. The stones were wet, and a thin film of water reflected the nearby lamp. He stepped onto the platform carefully, mindful of the slickness, and stood at the edge, looking out. The canal here was very calm. The water's surface was a dark mirror, broken only by the occasional ripple. The reflections of lamps were long and steady, and the windows across the canal looked like warm rectangles floating in the black. He stood there and let the scene fill him. This was what he had needed. He realized, not entertainment, not distraction, not even conversation, though he liked those things too. He had needed a quiet moment of beauty that asked nothing from him. He had needed to feel safe in the world again, to remember that life could be gentle. He thought of the day he had left behind, the little tensions and tasks. They were still real, but they had lost their sharpness. They seemed farther away, softened by distance and by water, and by the simple fact of being alive in this calm evening. He let his gaze drift along the canal. A boat's cover lifted slightly in a breeze, then settled. A rope shifted with a faint creak. A light in one window turned off, leaving the reflection of that window to fade from the water. Another light remained. The canal accepted the change, without comment. He realized the city was gradually preparing to sleep. Shops were closed. Windows were dimming. The street sounds were fewer. Even the drizzle seemed to be relaxing, becoming less determined, more like a lingering touch than a weather event. He stayed on the platform until he felt ready to move again, then stepped back onto the path. His shoes made the same soft sound, steady and quiet. He began to walk back in the direction he had come, not retracing every step exactly, but following the canal as it looped. The city felt different now, not because it had changed much, but because he had. The lights seemed warmer. The reflections seemed calmer. The smells seemed richer. As he walked, he passed the late-open bakery again. The door was closed now, the lights dimmer, but the warmth still lingered. The smell was fainter but present, like a memory. He imagined the baker locking up, heading home, leaving behind a clean counter and an empty display, ready to be filled again tomorrow. He crossed the broader bridge once more. The iron railing was wet and cool under his fingers. The lamps on the stone pillars glowed steadily, and their light made his breath visible again. He paused briefly at the center and looked down at the water, as if saying a quiet good night to the canal. The plashing sound was still there, patient. The reflections still moved, soft and alive. The city still held him. On the far side, he walked through the narrow streets where the cobblestones shone. The drizzle had almost stopped now, leaving the air damp and fresh. Water clung to the stones and made the lamps' reflections brighter. His footsteps were still gentle, and he noticed how carefully he was walking, not out of fear of slipping, but out of respect for the quiet. A window above him opened slightly, and a warm voice said something to someone inside, nothing he could understand, just a soft phrase that sounded affectionate. Then the window closed again, and the warmth remained in the air for a moment, like a hand on the shoulder. He passed the small square again. Cafe was closed now, lights mostly off. The trees stood quietly, their branches dripping. A street lamp reflected in a shallow puddle near the curb, making a small circle of light. He stepped around it without thinking, preserving the reflection as if it were a fragile thing. When he reached his own street, it felt welcoming. The buildings were familiar, the lamps spaced evenly, the doors solid. He walked a little slower, as if he didn't want to break the spell too quickly. But he knew the calm would come with him. The canal had given it freely. At his doorway, he paused and looked back down the street, imagining the canal not far away, continuing to carry light and reflections through the sleeping city. The water would keep moving quietly. The bridges would keep standing. The lamps would keep glowing until morning. And the city, old and gentle, would keep breathing. He felt gratitude again, simple, full, and warm. Gratitude for the evening's softness. Gratitude for wet stone and soft steps. Gratitude for the distant smell of baking that had followed him like a kind companion. Gratitude for the sound of water, always ready to soothe. He opened the door and stepped inside, bringing with him the memory of the canal's lights, the shimmer of reflections in dark water, and the steady, comforting music of the city at rest. And as the night continued, quiet and safe, it felt easy to imagine that somewhere out there, the canal was still listening, still holding the lights, still letting them tremble gently with each last trace of mist, still offering its calm to anyone who chose to pause on a bridge and hear the soft, steady plash of water against old